Hi, everyone. Good evening. My name is Matthew Victor. I am the president of the Good Governance Project, an initiative at Boston College Law School. I'm proud to present the event today, Privacy and Democracy, Threats and Opportunities in the Digital Age. I think this topic is particularly important today and this year. I actually took a class on privacy law with our moderator, Professor Hurley, this past fall, and I confess at the beginning of the class, I was one of those people who said, privacy is a lost cause, it doesn't really matter. And I was certainly singing a different tune by the end of the class. This is an immensely important issue. Information is power. The old adage is certainly true, and who controls that information is worth thinking about seriously. Please enjoy the event today. If you have any questions, feel free to use the Q&A feature. We will get to those questions at the end of the event. And I'm happy to introduce our moderator. Professor Hurley teaches at Brown, Boston College, and Harvard. She has published many pieces on this space and served on the US Privacy Shield court in the EU. So Professor Hurley, I will pass you the virtual microphone now.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome. I'm Deborah Hurley, and as Matt said, I teach privacy law at BC Law School. The subject of this seminar today is privacy and democracy. As we get started, I want to thank the sponsors of this event. So there are 3 of them: the Good Governance Project, the Clough Center, and also BC Law's Intellectual Property and Technology Forum. We have a distinguished group of speakers today. I will introduce them very briefly because we only have 1 hour, and they've consented to that. They're happy to use the time to speak substantively. So our speakers are Kade Crockford, who is the director of the Technology for Liberty program at the ACLU of Massachusetts. Another speaker is Amanda Renteria, who is the CEO of Code for America. And our third speaker is Professor Fred Yen, who is the Boston College Law School professor of Internet and Intellectual Property Law. So as you will have noticed, the title tonight is Privacy and Democracy. And most of the time when people think about privacy and personal data protection, they think immediately and solely about individuals' privacy. And that is important, certainly, and important to each individual who is concerned. But I would maintain that privacy and personal data protection is actually even more important for communities and the maintenance of community. So individuals, a person must have a space in which to develop their thought away from public scrutiny and the gaze or glare of government. And we have a right in the United States, a constitutional right to freedom of movement and freedom of association. So that ability to move, to gather with others, these are important constitutional values. And so they're important, especially for particular activities such as religious worship. Indeed, in many religions, an important or required component of worship is to gather in community, not only individual worship, but to gather with others, to gather in community. Also very important for political speech, the right to, again, form ideas, have discourse, and so forth. So privacy and personal data protection are important for the maintenance of community and also for the maintenance of democracy, which, as we know, expresses the will of the people. So as we move forward, we need to preserve spaces, both physical and virtual, where people can form their thoughts unobserved, untrammeled, in private, and then engage in discourse with others through movement, again, whether in physical space or virtually, or to gather, to associate. So these are the challenges of privacy and democracy and what we'll be taking up this evening. So we're going to get started. We're going to do this in a conversational style rather than each person making a set presentation. So let me get started with the first question, which actually is to all 3 of you. And the first question is, do you think that we undervalue the importance of privacy in the discussions that we have about democracy, maintenance of democracy, and democratic values. Kade, you want to get us started?
Sure. I think that unfortunately, well, first, let me just say thanks for the invitation. It's lovely to be here. Good evening, everybody. Yeah, I think we do. One of the struggles that we're facing in this country, unfortunately, is that one of the main political parties of the two political parties seems to take an approach to electoral politics that aims to preserve minority rule. And, we see that right now in the rash of voter suppression laws that Republicans have been proposing throughout the country. We see that in the fact that, the Republicans in Congress have been pretty clear that they're not going to support HR 1 or Senate Bill 1, which is the massive Voting Rights Act that the Democratic Party is trying to pass to make it easier to vote. So I think the answer to your question is yes, but that issue doesn't get enough attention, unfortunately, because we are still fighting 20th century battles about, basic voting rights. And I think if we were to move beyond some of those questions, as other developed countries like Australia, for example, which has a national holiday to vote, and voting is actually required in Australia. If we were able to move beyond the question of whether or not everybody in the country who's a citizen should be able to vote, and make it easy for people to vote instead of fighting 20th century battles again and again and again about who can vote and how difficult it is to vote, that we might be able to get into the details of some of why privacy matters for our democracy. Which is one of the reasons why here in Massachusetts, actually, the ACLU, which is, as many of you know, a nationwide organization, we have affiliates in all 50 states and in Puerto Rico and DC. We have been able to take on issues at the intersection of technology and civil rights and democracy in a way that some of our colleagues in states that are still fighting voter suppression laws have not been able to do, right? Voting rights aren't perfect here in Massachusetts, but certainly we don't face the kind of barriers that some people do throughout the country. And we don't face the kind of, onslaught every legislative session of dealing with proposals that are aimed to reduce access to the ballot. So yeah, I think privacy matters a hell of a lot for democracy. Edward Snowden has said a bunch of times something that's sort of related to what you said in your opening remarks, Deborah, which is that privacy is necessary for us as a society to develop socially and politically. I think as a gay person about the trajectory of the gay civil rights movement, and think about the fact that gay people, not that long ago in my mom's lifetime, were in a position where they had to lie about their sexuality in order to work, right? In order to pay their bills. That is obviously a massive encroachment on a gay person's ability to participate even in the workplace, let alone in the political sphere, right? So yes, sexual privacy is necessary in order for democracy to flourish, but privacy is necessary too for social movements to flourish, right? You look at what the federal government did in the 1950s and 60s and early 70s, the FBI and also the CIA actually working very hard to crush domestic dissent, mostly on the left and among Black civil rights advocates. That was, I think that's a really sort of condensed way of viewing how privacy matters for democracy, right? You cannot have a functional social movement if you are being attacked by a federal bureaucracy that has, tens of thousands of agents aimed at infiltrating your movement to destroy it from within. And, the success that the FBI had in dismantling the Black Panther Party, for example, really is a case study in how privacy matters for democracy and for social movements. I'll just give you one example and then I'll shut up. The FBI had informants infiltrate the Black Panther Party, learned that the Black Panthers had a dispute with another Black organization, and then acting on that information. You know, Matthew, to speak to your comments about how knowledge is power, acting on that information, which they only had because they violated the privacy of these Black Panther Party members, wrote fake letters, basically creating a feud, stoking this feud between these two organizations that actually led to murder. You know, said to the Black Panthers that this other organization was coming to their event that night to start a fight. And it resulted in people getting shot and killed. So, you know, that's a very extreme example of how privacy matters for democracy, but there are a whole host of others that we could talk about today. And I think, you know, Facebook and the Cambridge Analytica scandal is like a very obvious example of that, that I hope would resonate for people, you know, in the 21st century.
Right, and also when we think about things like, you know, standing outside a hall where a political gathering is occurring and watching who's entering, you know, taking roll call essentially, or watching who's, you know, in a virtual environment, there are many ways to do that very simply, right? Even geolocation or cell site location information, you can easily tell who is gathering, you know, for certain kinds of discourse.
That's right. And, you know, there's a famous Supreme Court case dealing with the membership of the NAACP, right? It is a First Amendment right to participate in our, you know, social and political organizations without the government identifying you as a member of those groups. And it's for good reason.
Exactly. All right, Fred, do we undervalue the importance of privacy in prominent discussions of democracy and democratic reform?
I'm sure we do. And I think that we probably overvalue it in some cases either. I think the contribution I'd like to make here right now is that it might do us some good in trying to figure out whether we under or overvalue privacy, to think about the different ways in which the term privacy might be relevant to the maintenance of democracy. You know, because most people think about privacy as freedom from surveillance, and it is absolutely critically important. And as Kade suggested, I think it's absolutely right that you need some free space, free from prying eyes, to be an autonomous human, to develop as a human. And I think that's a precondition for, you know, active participation in democratic society. We might also want to talk about privacy in the sense of its autonomy promotion. In other words, one can say that that's my private decision. That doesn't mean other people don't know I've done it. Like, it's my private decision whether I decide to vote. If I decide to vote, it's my private decision, but surely lots of people will know I voted and there's nothing I can do to stop them. And I think that autonomy is important for us to think about here in the sense of democracy as well, because autonomy, of course, you know, some things are like who you vote for. That should be an entirely autonomous decision. But I also think that as we talk about the use of autonomy, and in some cases, the way privacy, and in some ways, the way we think about surveillance or things like anonymity interact with that, they can also be used to evade accountability. And I think accountability is a very significant part of what we need to think about here with respect to privacy and the maintenance of democracy, because one of the reasons our democracy is under such stress now is that there have been some very irresponsible actors with respect to you know, their invocation of privacy. And maybe that's all I'll say for now. I can elaborate further if you like.
Okay, good, thank you. All right, we'll look forward to you elaborating further. So welcome, Amanda. And the question on the table is, you know, when we think about privacy, do we undervalue the importance of privacy in democracy or democratic reform or maintenance of democracy?
Sure. Well, thank you for having me here. It's great to join you today. And thank you for everyone who's tuned in. Yeah, the short answer to that is yes. The vantage that I feel like, and I'm in the space that Fred is a little bit here, which is it kind of depends on when you're talking about privacy and how complicated in some cases it is and how it shows up in different ways. As an example, Code for America does a work in the criminal legal system where we are trying to do automatic record clearance for folks, right? And something that comes up often is, where does your right to know intersect with my right to be forgotten, right? And how do you grapple with that in the criminal legal system? Which is very different, right? That's a very different thinking than on our other work where we're really trying to reach low-income folks for safety net benefits or tax benefits, where the government already has what you should be owed to the government in tax refunds, but you have to go find it yourself and then put it in the system in order to get your check. Whereas 30 other countries on this planet actually send a check out and say, is this right? And if this is right, we can either direct deposit or here's your check, right? And so there are, so as we talk about privacy, it is important to understand when and how it's used and in what places, because it can be positive, it can be negative, but those application and that sort of depth of conversation is something that's really important for the public discourse to really understand. And then the last piece, of course, is in the political world, where for the most part, we're asking for accessibility and transparency. But what does that mean for people to know, particularly, and I'll talk about particularly women running for office as an example, right? The idea that some politicians, or it's out there and it's just public, and the way that different people are responded in the public, their privacy is completely taken away and they're out there in the public. What are the parameters around that piece of it? So the answer to that is, of course, yes. And I think the reason why it's yes is because we as a public have a lot to wrestle with in terms of privacy in different spaces and places, and how it's used or should be used for a good democracy or a healthy democracy going forward.
Right, thank you. And again, none of these rights is absolute. We all know that, right? They're in competition with one another. And you mentioned, for example, the right to be forgotten, which will probably come up a little bit later in this conversation too. But of course, that bumps up against the maintenance of the historical record, journalistic integrity, and a number of other important values that we have as well. So that actually is a good segue to my next question, which is for Kade, who's done extensive work on how government can use technology to impede the rights of the privacy of individuals. And so this tension, among that. And Kade, I'd like you especially, and you can talk about other contexts as well, but there's recent Massachusetts legislation relating to facial recognition. And there was a really excellent piece that featured Kade in the New York Times about a week and a half ago that talked about the process here in adopting the legislation in Massachusetts. So the larger question is, government's use of technology to impede privacy or impede the rights of individuals. And then if you could also include and you're talking about that, the facial recognition work.
Sure. So, we live in the golden age of surveillance right now, of government surveillance, of corporate surveillance. The law obviously moves at a snail's pace compared to how quickly technology develops. Developers, hardware manufacturers don't have to wait for acts of Congress or acts of state legislatures or court rulings to roll out their new products. I think that makes sense. None of us would want to live in that world. But that has produced a scenario in which on the government surveillance side, which I'll focus most of my remarks on here, we see essentially policymaking through executive procurement instead of through the open legislative democratic process. And what that has looked like is the acquisition and deployment of a variety of very sophisticated surveillance technologies, not just by the FBI or the CIA in a foreign context, but by your local police department in a domestic context. So, access to data broker databases like Thomson Reuters and LexisNexis that contain huge quantities of information about pretty much every adult in the United States are accessible to police now at fusion centers. They don't need any reason to look up information about anybody. They can compile a pretty detailed dossier of everyone in the world or everyone in the United States simply by typing your name into a computer and hitting enter. So that's one way in which, the state has sort of piggybacked on the private surveillance state. But there are others too. License plate readers facilitate the collection of pretty detailed information about where motorists are going and when. In most states, there are no laws limiting how law enforcement can collect that information or even how they can use it, how long they can retain it, how they can share it, etc. And now we're also moving into the braver, newer world of the government developing or acquiring technologies like remote biometric surveillance systems, for example, face surveillance, that really facilitate a move away from the digital tracking of an object like a car or the digital the composition of a digital dossier, taking information from someone's credit report and their, property tax history and their online information, their search history, their IP address history, their location data from cell phone companies, and making it possible to fuse all of that sort of digital information with detailed information about our physical bodies and the movement of our physical bodies in physical space. And that concerns me greatly. And I'm especially concerned about the implications for the use of those technologies with respect to our democracy and how our democracy can function in a situation in which police departments, which I hope the movement that started some years back after the killing of Michael Brown and now has gotten a new gust of wind into its sails after the killing of George Floyd last summer, has shown us that law enforcement in the United States, by and large, is not accountable to anyone. I'm not sure if any of you have tried to do any police reform work, but police departments in the United States are notoriously unaccountable, even oftentimes to the democratic institutions or executive branch officials who are ostensibly in charge of them. It is very difficult for people who are outside of policing institutions to have really any sense of what's going on inside of them and how those technologies, those surveillance systems are being used. So I'm particularly concerned about the use of facial recognition surveillance in this context. We are increasingly seeing, well, really for the past 20 or so years since 9/11, we've seen the federal government pump upwards of billions of dollars into state and local governments for the purchase of surveillance equipment, including surveillance cameras, increasingly powerful surveillance cameras that are networked, right? So it's one thing to have one camera, right, that's maybe owned by a bank or Filene's, basement or something like that on one street corner. Well, that shows you, who's passing by that particular area. It's something quite different to have a network of surveillance cameras that covers an entire metropolitan area, which is what we have here in Boston. And the Boston Police Department has been working kind of behind the scenes with agencies including other police departments in the region, as well as the MBTA, which has more than 5,000 cameras in its system across, the metropolitan region, as well as the Boston Housing Authority and many other public entities, to link all of the existing government-owned surveillance cameras into one network, right? And that is frightening in its own right, but becomes extremely difficult to manage in a democratic society when you introduce something like facial recognition, analysis of video data, which could enable a scenario like what we are seeing in the Xinjiang region, the autonomous region in China, where the Chinese government has developed a very advanced facial recognition network on a network of surveillance cameras that enables them to, for example, monitor who goes to religious services and how frequently, right? Even whether someone enters their home from the front or rear entrance. And this is automated surveillance. This does not require a human being to look at the video footage. This is surveillance that enables a situation where, in the worst possible scenario, someone who has access to a networked surveillance camera system like this that has facial recognition video analytics built into it could enter the name of anyone, the mayor, a city councilor who's raising concerns about police overtime, for example, into a system like this, and then get a record automatically of every place that person was seen on camera, every person that person was walking with when they were seen on those cameras, and download a report essentially of the person's public activities, habits, associations, whether they were seen outside or walking into any sensitive locations like a strip club, a political meeting, an AA meeting, things like that. So, I'm very concerned about us allowing police departments, mostly through neglect, honestly, through us being busy with other stuff, to develop these surveillance networks that facilitate that kind of omnipotent power, right? The ability to see, not only in the present moment, but also for as long as you have video footage going back, a month, 6 months, a year, what everyone's doing, where everyone's going. And, I personally think we ought to prevent that from happening. So what we've tried to do in Massachusetts is to put forward a legislative framework that distinguishes between that type of surveillance use of facial recognition, which we believe ought to be banned permanently, that no government in Massachusetts should be developing or possessing a system that facilitates that kind of tracking, from a what I would call an image matching system that allows law enforcement, subject to a warrant, to identify an unknown person in an image who's suspected of committing a serious crime, with a warrant or in an emergency, because I view those as fundamentally different types of technology. So, that's what we're trying to do here in Massachusetts. The police reform legislation that was enacted at the end of last year and signed by Governor Baker does not do that. It merely creates some weak regulations around image matching, but leaves completely unregulated this larger problem of the creation of these face surveillance networks. So we're going back to the legislature. We are not done with this campaign. We're hopeful that the legislature will enact what it initially enacted in the police reform bill, which Governor Baker rejected, which was a bill that essentially did that, prohibited the use of facial recognition for surveillance purposes, but allowed it in narrow circumstances to identify people who are suspected of very serious crimes in still images. So we're continuing that fight, and we're also continuing to work to pass municipal prohibitions on the use of the technology by government. We've so far passed 7 of them. So if you're in Boston, you don't have to worry about the Boston police tracking you like that because it's illegal.
Great. And I think also facial recognition is the camel's nose under the tent, right? So there are many, many other, for example, gait is a great biometric. It's a great identifier, the way you walk. And that's very easy to attain that information at a distance. An iris scan or iris image, you've got to have some proximity, some, less and less, but something like gait. So, again, as people are just going about their normal lives, walking, these kinds of things. I think also, if other technologies, so it's again, camel's nose under the tent in terms of other technological areas. For example, in Chula Vista, California, they're using drones now. So they're using drones and they have certain rules around when it can leave the rooftop of the police station to start looking and so forth. But they're collecting all of this video that then you can start using, and you were getting toward that, Kade, too, predictive analytics and predictive policing, because we are tremendously habitual, all of us. So Fred, I want to shift the subject a little bit and ask you about, privacy and personal data protection contain both a human right. Privacy is a human right. Over 150 countries are signatories to conventions that state that, including the United States. But it's indisputable that personal data also has commercial value. That's how Facebook does what it does. That's how Google does what it does. So one of the issues is, how do we think about protecting something that has human rights aspects and also has value, or personally, the personal information has some value in it. So intellectual property is another example of an intangible, obviously, that has been protected for several hundred years now in various ways. So how might that help us think about how to protect privacy and personal data protection?
I actually am not generally a fan of using a property-like framework to deal with personal privacy. The reason for that is I don't think individual bits of information work well as property. You can apply an intellectual property framework perhaps to large collections like compilations of information. But really, in many cases, what we object to is we object to who knows, not that someone knows, or what they do with it, not that they know, right? So I might be very sensitive about my medical history. I don't care if my doctor knows. I don't care if my family knows. I don't care if my friends know, but I might care a heck of a lot if my health insurer knows, or I might care a heck of a lot if the government knows. And the problem that we have is that property isn't sensitive to those contexts of why somebody knows or what they might do with it. I tend to think of this more under, maybe this is because I teach torts, but, I tend to think of this much more as under a tort framework, because I think that tort is sensitive to reasonableness under circumstance. And that so much, we're not going to prevent this information from coming into existence. We can get into this kind of big philosophical question of whether information exists unless a person knows about it and records it or something like that. But that information is out there. And I don't think we're going to be able to stop people from observing information that is out there and collecting it. I think what we're going to have to do is to talk about when people do it, why they do it, what they can do with it when they have it. And so, I suppose you might have asked me this because I might have said, oh yes, let's turn pieces of personal information into intellectual property. I tend not to be a fan of that, even though I teach intellectual property.
Good. All right. Thank you very much. Amanda, I want to ask you a question as well, which is in terms of in your work for Code for America, and you've already alluded to some of this in the first remarks you made, and the innovation at Code for America, you must have come across many privacy related questions. How do can you give us examples of some of those and how you've negotiated them?
Yeah, so for a lot of our work, it really is, well, number one, I'll say it in this way. What harms our ability to actually reach a lot of the families we're trying to reach with government benefits is the lack of trust with the system, with giving you that information, with what the government might know about you. So this entire conversation about what government can do, there is a real understanding around privacy, which is I should be scared if I'm giving it to you. Even though you might be giving information on Facebook or giving information on video, we actually experience a lot more in some of our key programs, this distrust that has really now been embedded of what is government going to do with this kind of information. And it really does harm our ability to actually reach people where they are. But I want to weigh in a little bit on the conversation that has happened on how does technology limit or enhance democracy? I think we have reached a point that it's not that technology is no longer just limiting or enhancing. The question is whether it's distorting or educating. When you think about what has happened over the last 4 years in terms of how technology was used to distort now the storylines that are out there, whether it was in the election cycle or about politicians or about policy, that's really a distortion. And the question is going to be, as we think about technology going forward, is how do we use it as now a mechanism for educating people? Because in that same vein, not only in the sphere of politics, but what we even see as Code for America, this lack of trust actually allows distortion to happen or has happened. We're seeing it in COVID. We're seeing it in a lot of people that are trying to get government services, whatever it may be. There's this distortion that is set in. And it's actually made now the education piece even harder. And that's really the antithesis to really moving technology in a way that it can help democracy. And then the other sort of piece that I'd like to just bring in here, and it's really some of the conversation that Kade was having about these biases. One of the things that we face at Code for America is we recognize that we are taking systems, mainly moving them from paper-based to online. And if you just do that, what it means is we have quite a few systems that have inequitable outcomes. And if you just go to paper and technology, we will get more efficient at inequitable outcomes unless we are actually intentional about saying, now that we're going to bring technology in, it is incumbent at the very beginning stage of designing the system, of designing the algorithm, such that you take into account these biases so that when we place technology that's more efficient, that can move faster, that you're not just widening that gap more and more. So those are my comments as we think about technology as it moves forward.
Deborah, do you mind if I just jump in and respond to something that Professor Yen said? So you said something that made me think of my favorite anecdote about the law and its power to shape technology. When you said, we can't necessarily prevent the creation of information. And that is how we think about the law and technology now, but it hasn't always been. And I think wiretap law is a really crucial example of that, right? So in the 1960s, people became horrified by the idea that the government could listen into your phone calls, right? And that was considered to be a massive breach of privacy that upset people from the left to the right, everybody in the middle. And every state legislature and Congress passed a wiretap statute. And ours here in Massachusetts is extremely robust. Prosecutors basically can't wiretap anyone in Massachusetts because it's such a strong statute. And we defend it rigorously. Every year, the prosecutors try to expand it, and we fight those attempts. But there's a really interesting anecdote about the wiretap laws that I think most people don't think about, which is the development of CCTV cameras. CCTV cameras that are manufactured on a mass scale for use in, banks and by governments do not include audio recording. And that is because of the wiretap law, right? They only record video. And the reason for that is that in many states, it's unlawful to secretly record someone speaking. And, that's changed a little bit with companies like Ring, Amazon's company that makes, video doorbells that also record audio. I personally think those are illegal in Massachusetts, actually, and I think somebody's going to get sued eventually, and they're going to lose because you're not allowed to secretly record someone speaking in the state of Massachusetts. We're not a two-party consent state, but you can't do it surreptitiously. And so anyway, that is one example of how the law very bluntly shapes the development of technology. And so it's not that it's impossible for us to, pass laws that prohibit the creation of certain kinds of data. It is. We've done it. I mean, wiretap law is a perfect example of that. I think that technology is just moving so fast now that we just don't do it. We don't think about the law that way anymore.
So one of the things that your very interesting and prescient remark reminds me of is that when we talk about surveillance, and particularly government surveillance, we understand that that takes place against a backdrop of other technological development, which is privacy enhancing technology. For example, the internet itself is privacy enhancing technology because, as the famous cartoon says, on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. And so we have this game of cat and mouse that's going on. You have people who want to behave in ways that are genuinely antisocial, and they know it, but they want to use privacy to avoid the accountability. So I will post under some anonymous name on the internet, under, behind a virtual private network and whatnot, that makes it very difficult to find out who I am. And I'm going to do things that are very antisocial. We all have examples from the news of what that is. Right. In a society that's going to have law enforcement or going to ask law enforcement to counteract some of this illegal behavior, it's a really interesting question. To what extent do we allow law enforcement to bulk up its surveillance capabilities in order to deal with these particular threats? So if the threat of mass shooting is something that we think is, it may well be, exacerbated by certain kinds of privacy, to what extent do we want law enforcement to have bulked up surveillance to protect us from mass shootings? I don't have an answer to that question. I just think that when we talk about privacy and its role in democracy, it's true that unchecked government surveillance is very, very unhealthy to democracy. But some level of government surveillance is also necessary to the maintenance of democracy, especially when people use privacy to avoid accountability or responsible behavior. And then that raises the question again of what's the balance and how we think about privacy when we talk about overvaluing or undervaluing it.
Yeah, I mean, I would submit that the problem with mass shootings is guns, but that's a subject for a different.
I think clearly guns are part of it, but I guess I would say also there's a fair amount of misinformation that's out there that's broadcast anonymously that probably contributes to the resentment that is the precipitating, a precipitating factor in why some mass events happen. And again, I'm not an expert on this. It's not just one thing. There's many things going on that cause it, and certainly not absolving guns of that.
No, unquestionably. I just think misinformation is not illegal, right? It's not illegal to lie. And so that's a separate issue, right? I mean, whether the police have the authority to, search someone's Facebook account subject to some court order or warrant, I think that's not really what we're talking about here. They do have that authority and they do that. But, you can lie, that's not unlawful conduct in the United States.
Unless you get sued for libel like Ms. Powell.
Right,
Well,
we have
but
rules-
let me say, you know, one of the things that Matthew asked us to think about in terms of preparing for this panel were, you know, potential obstacles. One of the problems we do have with respect to technology and privacy is how do we hold people accountable for its misuse? You know, I don't think that rights exist and we can do whatever the heck we want and there are just simply no consequences to that. The consequences may or may not be criminal, they may or may not be legal, but there are still consequences.
Okay, one of the things is, you know, the life cycle of information. That's one of the things you're alluding to and have several times here, Fred. So there's, you know, the creation of the information, there's its initial use, its wider dissemination, and its destruction. So it's this whole life cycle of information. When you look at that, most of the regulation is around the second and third, the use and dissemination. That makes sense, and this is true historically because that's when the information is moving. So it's actually easier to see what's going on. We have very few restrictions on creation of information in the first place, you know, not only in the United States. And one of the prime examples is child pornography. And of course, the underlying act is illegal in itself, you know, and then we have relatively few rules around destruction of information, but we do have them. So it's that kind of middle area. Another thing is with regard to collection of the personal data in the first place, traditional data protection law, which is over 120 countries on earth have it. The United States is the extreme outlier. In fact, under federal law, this is the case. The federal government is subject to a law they adopted, but otherwise the US is an outlier, except for California a little bit, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. But you know, collection itself is highly regulated. So in the United States, the discourse over the last 20 years ago has been, you know, it's not the collection, we'll hoover it all up. It's the use, you know, and sort of through lobbying and so forth, trying to keep people focused on whether or not there should be some regulation of the use. But the collection in and of itself is viewed as problematic under traditional data protection law, which again is the dominant and very similar. It's very similar from country to country in these over 120 countries around the world. So let me turn now to California a little bit and ask you, Amanda, about, you know, you're in California, and of course we have all these recent statutes. So in terms of your work for Code for America and these recent statutes, what's your experience?
So first of all, I should just say, as a nonprofit, a lot of the privacy rules are different. So that's an important point. However, I also worked for, before working for Code for America, I worked as the COO for Attorney General Becerra during a lot of these different discussions. And I'll say this about it, which is it was really important to have a stake in the ground. And even as we're seeing in the last month, because once you start to put some pen to paper and it's out there and you have to enforce it, you have to actually draw the line somewhere. What we have learned and what we've all learned is that this discussion is still very early. And just last month, or actually, I think it was this month, Attorney General Becerra had to come back and say, okay, you can't be confusing as you release the data, right? And so one of the aspects, and we had quite a few conversations about this, while it was not yet law, but there was a big question around how do you do it? What are the policies and laws and rules look like? And I think part of the real, as we look at it here in California, part of the real benefit is that you put something out there and now we can all respond to what worked and what didn't, what went too far and what didn't. I think what most people would say now is that it's pretty tough to enforce and that hasn't been figured out. So even if you now get the law right, how do you build the tech talent? How do you make sure you can actually hold people accountable and enforce it? And that's still really a long ways off. And I think what you would hear in a lot of the different conversations of tech for good and making sure to really protect people is that there's a lot of still work to do in those spaces. And it really is going to take a full body of law and enforcement and policy all across the country to get this right. And I think most people would say we've got a long way to go, but it's good that California started a process so that we can all learn from and grow from. But there's a lot to do here, and tech companies are ahead. I mean, they keep moving in places, and that's going to always be a catch-up game, particularly when government agencies do not have the kind of tech talent, even at the basic level that you need in order to have proper kind of enforcement and oversight on a lot of these policies that were put into place.
very interesting. I mean, since I teach privacy law, the regulatory process after the California Consumer Privacy Act was adopted, and then the regulations were being created. And then it was like, well, we're not quite done. We're going to delay that. Okay, we're going to consult again. So I was updating that for each group of students. So it was very interesting for me personally watching that process and the push and pull that took place there. What's also interesting to see, I mean, obviously California is such a dominant part of the US economy. So the fact that California now has these laws, what company in the United States doesn't want to do business in California and reach California consumers? So the effect that the California laws will have more broadly in the US. And also California is the 5th biggest economy in the world, bigger than the UK. So again, who doesn't want to be doing business in California? So for other countries as well, as they try and interface with California, I think it'll be very interesting.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the things just to add to that, and I think most people might not have as much of an insight on this, but as you're building those regulations or as you're having stakeholder meetings, you do hear quite a bit from companies, right? If you go too far, we will move. It's something you often hear, having been there on the receiving end of that. But I'll also say we don't hear enough of the other side of the story. We don't hear enough from advocates and activists. Some of that is a matter of just resources that a lot of these groups on the outside. So it really is, you need to have some of this tech talent within government. You need to have some of this privacy law and really a deep depth of experience inside the government in order to really ask the key questions of who's coming in and trying to, help, quote, help with the regulations. And I think this piece, because it is so new to government, we don't even have some of the right classifications to even have people on the other side of the table to ask these probing questions that will get you to better policy, that will get you to better enforcement and accountability.
You've all of you have touched on social media issues here, and I've kind of steered us away, but now we're going to come right at it here for a little bit. So I want to start with you, Fred. Obviously there are so many social media issues here. So are there social media reforms that we should be considering at this point?
Well, I have an idea. I don't know how firmly committed I am to that, but I think that there needs to be some kind of mechanism to hold various users of, that's not just social media, but just various people disseminating information to some level of responsibility for what they do. And so I've toyed in my mind with the extent to which fraud ought to be part of our discourse, and whether people should be thinking about actions against people for essentially fraudulent information being disseminated. It doesn't seem to me that, well, this is the question I'm asking, and I say this, in the spirit of an academic discussion where I don't really know the answer. So, not that I'm ever going to be up for confirmation to the Supreme Court and somebody will whip this video out and go, see what a nut he is? I mean, I'll concede the point. Let's take a look at election, the deliberate dissemination of crazy falsehoods about who won the election. And you take someone like Sidney Powell, who is busy spreading them, right? She can be held responsible because a company decided its reputation was injured and they sue. And, I think she's in bad shape on her libel case, at least as I understand libel law. But if you spread lies, if she had spread that lie and not named Dominion voting, she would be able to use law to remain unaccountable for that, the same behavior, the same harm to our society, and she's unaccountable. And I'm wondering, at what point do we need to have actions from people who think they have been injured in some more diffuse way to bring a suit? The action that I've toyed with in my head is deliberate misinformation by news organizations. Deliberate. I'm not talking about mistakes. Deliberate. If you hold yourself out as telling people the truth or making a good faith attempt to tell people the truth, but in fact you're not, are you not defrauding your consumer? That is to say, your viewer. Should we not consider whether such actions should be, become part of our legal landscape? I'm not saying yes. I just think that it's time to think about these things.
Yeah, I mean, one way to deal with that would be to bring back the fairness doctrine,
See, I'm not sure if it's the fairness doctrine that I'm interested in here, where you're trying to get both sides. I'm talking about outright fraud. If you are, you pick your favorite news network. I don't have to name names. And you want to deliberately broadcast a false narrative about who won the election. And you are going to hold yourself out as disseminating the truth as news. I just think that's plain fraud. It's not about should you make room for opposing points of view. I just don't think that someone holding himself or itself out as a purveyor of truth is permitted to say, I'm going to tell you the truth and I'm going to deliberately lie to you now. I think that that's a problem.
Yeah, I mean, the fairness doctrine wasn't, my understanding of it at least, wasn't necessarily about presenting like both sides of an argument, but about presenting information in a way that's honest and fair. And so, you know.
You mean fair and balanced?
Yeah, right. So if the fairness doctrine existed today, I assume that the FCC might have grounds to withdraw Fox News's license because it is certainly not honest.
Right, but again, we have all kinds of laws that give the FCC the right to regulate traditional media, particularly broadcast media, under various constitutional rationales. But that doesn't apply to an online purveyor of news, for example, where the harm is just.
That's the question before us today, right? With the Communications Decency Act and other things is, should some of the rules that apply to other media also apply to platforms, internet platforms and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, CDA 230 is, reviled on the left and the right, and actually for different reasons, right? One for promoting misinformation, the other for removing misinformation. So maybe maybe they did it right. I don't know.
Okay, well, it's time for we have a few questions here from the people who have been kind enough to listen to this webinar, and I want to just raise them because we're coming toward the end of our hour. So I have a question for you, Amanda, from someone who asked, can you give any examples of recent technology applications that have been used to create more equitable systems?
Yeah, so sure. It's my chance to talk about some of our most proud programs, which are getyourrefund.org, which is a free mobile application for families, low-income families. Truly free, where it's not tricking you at the end or you have to pay something if you make 66,000 or less. But it's not just that that it actually is free in and of itself, but the way it was built on research, talking to folks who were offended by some of the questions. So we literally go through a redesigning process in what's called our user research team and sit with folks who actually spend time on those forums going, I don't know what this means, or it took me 2 hours. I don't have 2 hours in my day. I'm working 2 different jobs, 3 different jobs. And so the entire mobile app is actually, 1, it's mobile, but 2, built on a people-centered, human-centered design. And what we know of that and the way we know it is equitable is because we actually can measure the data on the outset. Who applied? How did they apply? What was the breakdown in that? The other piece to it is we were the only ones who did it in dual languages. We knew that was important. We also presented our Get Your Refund product with United Way and with some of the volunteer sites that people trusted and believed in. So we actually made it look to you as, United Way as opposed to government, which actually really helped, particularly with folks, more Black and brown communities who are afraid of government. They were able to get their tax refunds. We certainly told them, but we walked them through a process that really was more equitable to actually reach them. And the outcomes proved that when you actually treat people with dignity and respect, when your program shows up as like, we're glad you're here, as opposed to who are you and how much money did you make, right? That feels very different. And we continue to see that. The other piece is you don't really think about systems that reach people as having a particular style and way, but the very first question or the second question really is a cultural competent message to people. And when you're a government service or a government service delivery system, you're trying to have conversations with a lot of different people. And if you've actually built the system based on a particular kind of person, it doesn't actually, that simple question reaches very differently to maybe the people you're trying to target. So that's just one of our Get Your Refund. The other is our Get CalFresh program. That's food stamp program that is in multiple languages, again, built upon community leaders, and working with really really sitting with people to understand their lifestyle and what they're going through and the way they receive questions. And so if we could just build our systems with the people they are intended to serve in mind, we will have equitable systems. But that does mean redesigning the entire process in and of itself and focused on the people that have been left out.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to ask you, each of you, to answer this question. So we'll go in order. We'll start with Kade and go to Fred, and then end with you, Amanda. So when you think about this area of privacy and democracy in the United States, what is the one thing that can be done today? So that's something that can be done, not a wish list. What is the one thing that can be done today that would most improve privacy and democracy in the US? We'll start with you, Kade.
Well, my view is that all of these questions about technology and democracy are really questions about power. And so, when Amanda was speaking about the influence that technology companies have over the regulatory process and had over the process of law reform in California, I think that that's really the meat of the issue. There are a lot of smart people who have been thinking for many years about law reform solutions to the many problems that we face at the intersection of technology and government and civil rights and civil liberties and democracy. It's not like we don't have good ideas. The problem is that we don't have the people power to enact those ideas into law because of the influence of money in politics, because of the influence of major tech companies. Frankly, because this is something I said in the chat, because of the lack of technologists in government who are, sufficiently competent to be able to, understand how these systems work, understand how the companies operate, and, as Amanda said, provide lawmakers and regulators not only with the right questions to ask, but also with the right policy framework and regulatory expertise to enforce the law after we've enacted it. So, my response to this question is always more democracy. We need to fight these attacks on voting rights, because if you don't do that, we're not going to get good outcomes in terms of technology and policy. We need more people to get engaged in local politics, in state politics, which are the laboratories for democracy in the United States. And we need to address the issue of money in politics. We need to make sure that, in these debates that are upcoming in Congress about consumer privacy law, that the tech companies don't dominate and that they aren't the ones who are ultimately writing the laws that are going to, regulate them. And that issue is the same when we're talking about government surveillance. The FBI and police departments should not be the ones writing the rules. It should be the people who are in charge of deciding, what the limits on government surveillance ought to look like. So we need more political participation to enact all of the good ideas that, the people in this room and many, many other people across the country have about how we need to reorient our systems.
Thank you. Fred, what's the one thing that can be done today that would most improve privacy and democracy in the United States?
Well, this is one of those things where the professor asks a question that I was not prepared to answer, but off the cuff, I think I would seriously consider increasing the warrant requirement before government undertakes certain kinds of investigative behavior. I think that when I think about privacy, my biggest concern is ultimately the state versus the citizen. It's not that commercial surveillance isn't distasteful, it is, but in the end, what really frightens me most is the power of the state against the individual. And I think the warrant requirement is something that we could use to keep it in check.
Right, and that is currently, the Carpenter case was the most recent big one in 2018, but where that is evolving to address technology. And I agree with you. Governments can show, they have tanks and they can show up at your door and take you to jail. So yes, it's a different level of power. Amanda, what's the one thing that can be done today that would most improve privacy and democracy in the United States?
Well, I'm going to take a little bit of a longer term approach. We've got to start educating our kids both about technology and government. If there's anything we've all learned during the pandemic, our kids have learned quite a bit about technology in now the learning that they've done at their computers, at their desks. But if we are not starting that process now about what privacy means, where this thing is, what you are learning, what you are giving away, then we'll never get to where we need to govern a country in a way that can use technology well. And we need to make sure that we bring government education back into the process and actually have kids now feel a very big responsibility to be civically engaged, that it is up to all of them to make sure that the direction of this country is fitting for everyone. So it's a little bit of a longer term approach, but something that we can put in curriculum now.
I agree with that. Great. Thank you very much. Thank you again to our sponsors for this event this evening. And thank you so much to our speakers, Kade Crockford, Amanda Renteria, and Fred Yen. Thank you and good night.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, folks. Good night.